As the gray morning draped over Fairmont Crest like a shroud, Donnell entered the new day with a chill creeping up his spine, unaware that in a few breaths his entire world would be irreparably fractured. The truth came crashing down like a verdict without a jury. Vanessa was pregnant, and the child belonged to Joey, both the shadow behind the secret agreements and the blade hidden in the polite smile. From that moment, the grief that had not yet cooled turned into a thick, swirling rage, accompanied by a head-splitting sense of betrayal, forcing Donnell to face the cruelest question of his life: protect his mother's honor or burn down the web of lies that covered his family. As Vanessa wrestled with guilt and survival instinct, and Joey built a wall of power in black and white, the game of conspiracy had begun. Where every step was a new cut and every exit was filled with the smell of burning bridges. Donnell never thought that a life already torn by tragedy could be fractured so cruelly. He had believed that the biggest shock of his life was the night the car plunged into the abyss, the sound of crushing metal and the smell of burning gasoline still lingering like a curse. But this morning, the truth rushed into the already airless room: Vanessa was pregnant, and the child was Joey's. There were no words to contain the feeling of betrayal. Even his anger paled in comparison to the silent collapse of what he had used to reassure himself. Donnell stood facing the test results hastily clipped in a folder that still smelled of ink, realizing that from this moment on, every memory of his mother not only carried the pain of loss but also stabbed into his heart a dirty needle of doubt, humiliation, and an unnamed rage. The prolonged silence between mother and son was not an option, but the only thing that was safe enough to keep the house from falling apart again. However, inside Donnell, the arguments had lined up, the questions had drawn blood, and the dark scenarios began to operate like a machine without brakes. Vanessa sat in front of the window where the daylight usually soothed everything, but today only exposed the ugly fragments of a life eroded by guilt and reckless decisions. She knew, from the moment she saw the two red lines on the test stick, that there was no way out without stepping on her own footprints. Each step reflected only another image of failure. Joey was not just a lover in a moment of weakness, not just a name floating between signing meetings and tired nights. He was part of the Fairmont Crest's web of power and secrecy. Where every relationship was broken down into benefits and risks, where every touch could be proof. Vanessa understood that her body no longer belonged to her alone. It had become a battlefield where honor, money, trust, and life collided, leaving bruises that no one saw. Her repentance did not lighten things. On the contrary, it was like a new skin covering an old wound, more sensitive, more vulnerable, and always reminding her that mistakes never stand alone. Joey, with the poise of someone who knows how to bend a room to his will, took into account the changing pulses in Vanessa's body. He didn't need to say anything to control the situation. The documents, the confidentiality clauses, the stock ownership, and the invisible debts had long spoken for him. Joey knew that Donnell was the type of person who couldn't stand the smell of lies and would dig until he found the bones of truth, so he had his cards ready. A charity that had been promoted as a community heart suddenly became a financial escape hatch. A land deal on the edge of town that was priced unusually high could hide the cost of discreet rendezvous. And most important, Joey had in his possession a string of text messages, a few photos, a few vague testimonies that made Vanessa appear to be the seductress, enough to make people suspect that what had happened was not a simple mistake, but a two-way negotiation. For Joey, a being growing up in the shadow of scandal was not a miracle, but a strategic asset. It turned him from a suspect into someone with responsibility, with the right to speak up, with an excuse to intrude further into the already devastated private life of the mother and daughter. Donnell's protective instincts flared up at the same time as his need for revenge. He loved his mother as the only remaining part of his family, but he also hated the way she had pushed them into the quagmire of a wrong relationship. That night, when he reviewed the CCTV footage from the parking lot behind the restaurant where Vanessa and Joey had met, Donnell saw his mother walking quickly, her hands shaking, while Joey appeared leisurely as if signing another lucrative contract. Without words, the video was enough to blacken her reputation. And Donnell knew that if he leaked the images, he would blow the last cover that had kept his mother from public judgment. But if he remained silent, he would become an accomplice to the growing shame. Caught between two lines, he searched old files related to the accident, reviewed forensic reports, scoured the last calls on his father's phone, searched for any trace of Joey's hand in their family's fate earlier than anyone thought. The more he searched, the more he sensed something ominous, a payment that went through 3 layers of shell companies, a deleted text message that was uncomfortably timed, and an anonymous email that added fuel to the fire. He wasn't sure he had absolute proof, but he knew he was on the right path in a maze someone had set up to make him give up halfway. Vanessa, in the early days of morning sickness, found everything around her too loud. The whispers of the waiter outside the door, the strange looks as she walked through the hall, the sound of Joey's office door closing in the distance, all blended together into a harsh music that made it hard to breathe. She wanted to disappear, to pack her body and her mistake into a suitcase that no one would open, but the occasional throbbing in her stomach called her back to reality. Vanessa wondered if she was punishing herself by keeping the baby, if she had the courage to break the cycle with a controversial decision, if she should make the choice that her son would never forgive. She considered leaving Fairmont Crest quietly, leaving everything to the storm to take its course. But she knew, with the contract in place, with Joey's omnipresent gaze, there was no train for people with secrets who wanted freedom. Joey began to roll out, protective, moves couched in the sage language of adult responsibility. An email was sent to Vanessa's lawyer, politely mentioning media safety and medical support plans. An additional agreement about the rights to the child after birth, with the condition of silence. A proposal for a reconciliation roadmap that put Vanessa in the position of accepting that everything began and ended in the polite space controlled by him. On the surface, this was reassurance. Inside, this was the final springboard for the already designed trap. If Vanessa signed, she acknowledged Joey as the center of stability. If she refused, she became reckless, selfish, putting a living being in danger of public opinion. Joey understood that words like responsibility, future, stability were reins for a disoriented mother. He understood better than anyone that the fighting conspiracy at Fairmont Crest was not fought with shouts but with black and white paper, with polite smiles and a single signature. Donnell saw before his eyes the future of his mother and child framed in the order Joey was drawing. He did not want to lose another loved one just because he was one step too late. So he chose a risky route, not making a big fuss, not shouting in the hall, but quietly building a hard truth with evidence and allies. He seeks out those Joey has heard in silence, a contractor pushed into bankruptcy after being terminated for unknown reasons, a former employee with forgotten emails on a server, a partner who signed a deal that was unfavorable because of threats of exposure. Each story is a shard of glass, each piece of evidence a fresh cut on the palm of his hand, the sum of them is a mirror that reflects Joey's true face. Donnell carefully pieces together each piece, covering up witnesses, creating escape routes for them if things go south. He knows he's no saint, he wants revenge, but he also knows that revenge is only worth it if it makes the monster see itself in the mirror of law and public opinion. Meanwhile, Vanessa is caught between the fear of being scorned by her son and the fear of being swallowed by Joey. She began to write a letter to herself, a confession that no one would necessarily read, but was the only rope strong enough to pull her back from the abyss. She wrote about the long nights lost in the bitterness of regret, about the moment of weakness that turned a woman into willing prey, about how she collapsed before just enough care, just enough eyes, just enough promises. She did not ask for forgiveness, she just wanted to put on the table everything that was left of her, even if it was a pile of ashes. The letter ended on an ambiguous point: would she keep the child, or would she stop before it was too late? The answer floated between her gasps as the horizon ahead was only an endless gray ash. Joey sensed a change in the atmosphere. He heard, somewhere, the light footsteps of diggers. So he picked up his pace. A small party was scheduled under the guise of celebrating the new project, where people toasted over numbers, but really it was a test of loyalty. Joey put his hand around a few wrists, squeezing lightly as a reminder of authority. He sent a message to Vanessa about the best prenatal care at the affiliated hospital, trying to slip through the guilt barrier with the medical route as a gesture of concern, while also sending a satellite message to Donnell: don't make this a public tragedy." In the language of power, it was both an offer and a threat. In the language of someone who had just lost his father and was about to lose his mother to a wall of deception, it was a tinderbox. Donnell didn't back down. He knew that one misstep would be the impulsive one who had ruined the reputation of his pregnant mother, and so everything before that was rendered meaningless. He chose to strike at the place Joey thought was inviolable, a string of legal consulting bills that matched the timeline of the incident, a subcontract that smelled of inflated costs, a leaked internal memo from a former assistant describing a crisis scenario if the relationship were exposed. He didn't need to prove Joey had coerced or schemed from the start, he only needed to show that he was always willing to use everyone else's mistakes as leverage. At Fairmont Crest, crime rarely revealed itself as crime, it was disguised as risk management, mediation, support, and Donnell was determined to peel back each layer before Joey could retreat into the shadows again. Vanessa, by this point, knew that if the truth were exposed by her son's hand, she would have nowhere to hide. She saw her name in the news, saw the judgments raining down like hail, saw the child not yet born already branded with a shameful label. She wanted to stop Donnell, but any plea meant asking her son to accept some of the blame. She thought about confronting Joey directly, asking for a decent way out, a safe silence to decide her own future. But she also knew that, for people like Joey, nice only had value when exchanged for something measurable. And at the intersection of hope and reality, Vanessa realized the most terrible thing: the only thing she had enough autonomy to offer was her own body and the child, a trade-off she wasn't sure was still an option. Donnell's anger seeped into her blood like a slow poison. He began to think about the tapes, the old conversations with his father, the vague instructions that now sounded like prophecy. He began to suspect that the chain of events leading up to the night of the accident was more than an accident. And if that was true, all he was doing was the beginning of a larger excavation, where every name associated with Joey would be lined up to pay his debts. But he also saw his mother's eyes, dark and red-veined, like a lamp that had burned out its wax. Revenge might ease the pain, but would it save Vanessa from the self-destruction that burned inside her? The question, at any moment, could push him over the edge of an emotional cliff into a cold extreme, and Donnell feared the day when he would no longer tremble at burning it all down to regain some false sense of justice. Joey, on the other hand, begins to build a legal wall around the new situation. He orders a psychological report on the effects of the scandal on pregnant women. Contacts a media expert to create a compassionate narrative about the story of a responsible man, willing to care and provide despite dire circumstances. He prepares for both scenarios. If Vanessa keeps the child, he becomes a trustworthy father, winning sympathy. If she chooses a different path, he becomes a victim of a personal decision outside of his influence, diverting public opinion away from himself. AMMUUDAU's struggle is no longer in the shadows. It puts on its everyday clothes, walks into the meeting room, stands in front of the camera, signs prepared statements, and lets everyone believe that it was born to help. In the brief moment between the two storms, Vanessa puts her hand on her belly, feeling the pulse of life still very faint. She found herself drifting between two rocks, one with Donnell, whose eyes had dried up too early, the other with Joey, whose smile was like a thin knife. She knew that no matter which she chose, she would lose a part of herself. She could choose to protect the child to atone for the past, or stop to save her son from a new wound. Each path led to a door that could only be opened at a great price. She no longer believed in redemption, she only hoped that when it was all over, no one would be kept down any longer than necessary. Donnell put his plan together like a careful carpenter placing the last piece of wood in a door frame. He didn't make a fuss, didn't call out, didn't turn his mother's private matter into a public spectacle. He gave his file to someone he trusted so that when the time came, everything would go exactly as planned, nothing less, nothing more. He chose the moment when Joey pushed himself the highest, amid applause, amid articles praising his responsibility, so that the fall would be the most painful and the most witnessed. He knew this route might make his mother hate him again, but if he didn't do it, he would hate himself for the rest of his life. As night fell on Fairmont Crest, the large windows facing the slope where the accident had occurred years ago were still lit. In one room, Joey adjusted his tie, seeing in the mirror a man who had been used to surviving storms with status and letters. In another room, Donnell placed his hand on a stack of papers, feeling the weight of a choice that could burn the last bridge between him and his mother. In a darker room, Vanessa sat quietly on the edge of her bed, listening to the clock ticking steadily, trying to learn to breathe while waiting for a dawn that promised nothing but to expose more of the stains the night had not yet hidden. There were no heroes on the road ahead, no miracles, only people forced to pay for what they had done and what they had allowed to happen. Here, love was not enough to save anyone, loyalty only mattered when it stood up to the weight of truth, and every decision, no matter how small, could be the butterfly that tilted the hill of memory. And no matter who wins the upcoming AMMUUDAU struggle, the rest will have to live with their own ashes, for there are wounds that never close, only learn to bleed silently. The night closed on Fairmont Crest like a layer of ash, not promising a clear dawn but only prolonging the blurred traces of a truth that refused to stand still. Donnell put down the stack of documents, knowing that the moment he chose to expose everything was also the moment he burned the last bridge connecting him to his mother, but the silence had rotted too long to be able to protect anyone. Vanessa sat silently, her hand on her belly, feeling the fragile rhythm of life beating under her skin and knowing that any choice from here would cost a part of her soul, hold on to atone, or stop to cut the vicious cycle. Both paths were filled with the shadow of shame and judgment. Joey, in the midst of all the shiny agreements, had built a safe tunnel for himself, seemingly sealing off his reputation with the words, stability, and responsibility. But the storm was creeping in, slowly and surely. When the first mask fell, the rest would crack. At the bottom of the slope where the accident had occurred, the wind changed direction, and everyone understood that the real game had only just begun.